A mother breaks down in tears after uncovering a horrifying secret between her 13-year-old daughter and the family dog. Even more shocking, her daughter is pregnant. The twisted truth behind it will leave you speechless. Grace jerked awake, her heart pounding in her chest as a scream sliced through the thick silence of the night. She sat up, blinking into the darkness, trying to make sense of the chaos. The next sound that hit her was Bear's vicious barking, deep and guttural, echoing down the hallway. For a moment she was disoriented, still tangled in the remnants of her dream, unsure if what she'd heard was real or imagined. But there it was again, another panicked scream, this time louder, more urgent. "Mrs. Grace! Help! Please! Help!" Charlie's voice, clear, frantic. Grace's pulse raced as she threw the covers aside and swung her legs out of bed, barely registering the cold floor beneath her bare feet. She moved on instinct, rushing toward Olivia's room, her mind a blur of dread and confusion. What was happening? As she reached the door, Charlie stood frozen in the hallway, her eyes wide with terror, her whole body trembling. Bear's barking only grew more frantic, and Grace had to force herself to push past Charlie to get into Olivia's room. The sight that met her eyes made her world stop cold. Olivia wasn't just lying on the bed. She was thrashing weakly, her small body jerking as if in shock. Her nightgown torn and twisted around her legs, stained with a deep, horrifying red. Grace's stomach churned at the sight of the blood, so much blood soaking into the sheets beneath her. Olivia's face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes wide with terror, but unfocused, like she wasn't entirely there. She looked violated. Her hair was matted to her tear-streaked face, her lips trembling as she let out shallow, broken sobs. It was as though her body had given up, her limbs limp, even as she shivered in what could only be shock. And Bear. The dog stood at the foot of the bed, his teeth bared, snarling like a wild animal. His body was tense, muscles coiled like he was ready to pounce again. Grace's breath hitched in her throat as the pieces started to fall into place, her mind scrambling to reject the horrific conclusion forming in her head. "Bear, get back!" Grace's voice cracked, not out of fear for herself, but out of the sheer terror of what might have happened. The dog snapped his head toward her, growling once more before his body seemed to deflate, his aggression melting away as he slunk into the corner. But those eyes never left Olivia. Watching her, it made Grace's skin crawl. Charlie stumbled forward, her face as pale as a ghost, her voice barely more than a whisper. He was on top of her," she choked out, her eyes darting between Grace and Olivia's blood-soaked form. "It looked like he was doing it, Mrs. Grace. It looked like he was raping her." Grace froze. The word hit her like a punch to the gut, sending her spiraling into a haze of disbelief and horror. Rape? Bear? Her sweet, loyal dog? She wouldn't believe it. But Olivia's body told a different story, one that made Grace's blood turn to ice. Olivia's sobs grew louder, her hands gripping the sheet so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her face twisted in agony, her lips quivering as she muttered something over and over, too quietly for Grace to hear. "No, no, no, no." Grace knelt beside the bed, her hands shaking as she gently touched Olivia's arm. "Sweetheart," she whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Olivia recoiled at the touch, a terrified whimper escaping her lips as she turned her face away, her whole body trembling uncontrollably. The sight shattered Grace's heart into a million pieces. Her little girl, broken, bleeding, and too scared to even look at her. Grace's chest tightened, her breathing ragged. She felt like she was drowning, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to think, impossible to breathe. "Mrs. Grace." Charlie's voice broke through the fog of Grace's mind, her hands twisting nervously in her shirt. "I heard noises. I woke up and I saw him. Bear was on top of her, moving like a man would. I tried to pull him off, but he growled at me, and I was too scared he'd bite me. So I ran to get you." "No." Grace's voice was a broken whisper, her eyes locked on Olivia's frail body, curled in on itself as if trying to protect what was left of her innocence. "It can't be. He wouldn't." But the evidence was staring her in the face. The blood, the terror in Olivia's eyes, and the way her body was twisted in agony. Grace's heart shattered all over again as the realization clawed its way into her mind. Bear had been Olivia's protector for years, but now, in this single moment, it seemed like he had become her worst nightmare. There was no time to process the horror, no time to collapse under the weight of her guilt, her shock, her disbelief. Olivia needed help, and she needed it now. Grace's voice shook as she stood up, her body moving on autopilot. "We need to go. Now." She reached out to Charlie, her grip tight on the girl's arm. "Grab her blanket. We're going to Elena's." Charlie hesitated, her face pale with fear. But she nodded, her hands fumbling to grab the first thing she could find to cover Olivia. Grace moved to lift her daughter, careful not to touch the blood-soaked parts of her nightgown. Olivia whimpered as Grace picked her up, her small frame trembling uncontrollably in her mother's arms. "It's going to be okay," Grace whispered, more to herself than to Olivia. "We're going to get you help, sweetheart. I promise." But as she turned toward the door, Bear let out a low growl from his corner, his eyes never leaving Olivia. Grace's skin crawled with a mix of anger and fear. Charlie nodded mutely, wide-eyed and pale, and followed Grace as she moved with trembling hands to gather Olivia in her arms. The girl didn't resist, her body limp as Grace carefully lifted her, cradling her as if she were a fragile, broken doll. The bloodstain on her nightgown was a bright, horrific contrast to her pale skin. "We'll go through the back," Grace muttered, her voice low, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. She didn't know what had happened, couldn't process it yet. But she knew one thing. No one could know. Not yet. Not until she had answers. "Charlie," she said, glancing at the girl who still hovered by the door, "you say nothing. Do you understand me? Not a word to anyone. I'll take you home after we see Eleanor." Charlie's eyes welled up with tears, but she nodded. "I promise, Mrs. Grace," she whispered. Grace shot one last glance at Bear, who had calmed now, sitting by the door, his head lowered, but his eyes still fixed on Olivia. A chill ran through her. She didn't understand what was happening, but she didn't have time to figure it out. Not now. Bear, for all his loyalty, wasn't the immediate concern. Olivia was. The drive to Dr. Eleanor's private clinic felt like a blur. Grace's mind raced with too many questions, but she forced herself to stay calm. Olivia's head rested against her shoulder, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed, as if she'd retreated to someplace far away, unreachable. Grace felt powerless, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss she couldn't escape. When they arrived, Eleanor was waiting, surprised to see them at this hour, but instantly recognizing the panic in Grace's eyes. "What's going on, Grace?" Eleanor's voice was laced with concern the moment she saw her friend's pale, strained expression. Grace, barely holding herself together, felt the weight of everything finally break her. "It's Olivia," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Something horrible has happened." The words barely left her lips before she dissolved into sobs. Elena didn't waste a second, gently guiding them inside her small clinic. She moved with calm precision, but Grace could barely breathe, the panic suffocating her. As Elena started examining Olivia, Grace stood by, struggling to find the words to explain the nightmare. But even if she could, what would she say? Every breath felt heavy, her chest tight with fear. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by Olivia's shallow breathing. Finally, Elena turned to Grace, her face serious. "Grace, Olivia has suffered significant trauma," Elena said carefully, her voice steady but grim. "There's a tear. It looks like she's been through something physically severe." Grace's world crumbled beneath her. The room seemed to spin, her knees almost giving out. Her sweet girl, her Olivia, had endured something unspeakable. The pain was like a punch to the gut, but all Grace could think about was shielding her daughter from any further hurt. "What do we do, Elena? I can't let anyone find out. No one can know." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper, raw with emotion. She looked at Elena, desperate for reassurance. "We'll be discreet, Grace," Elena said softly but with certainty. "But first, we need to make sure Olivia is okay. That's our priority." That night, in the quiet of Elena's office, the weight of it all hit Grace, full force. Tears flowed freely as she leaned against the wall, consumed by fear and helplessness. Elena, ever composed, did her best to offer comfort. "Grace, I know this is overwhelming, but this could have been an accident. We can't jump to conclusions yet. You don't need to go public with this. Let's just focus on Olivia's recovery for now." Grace nodded, though the gnawing pit in her stomach refused to ease. Before they left, Eleanor gave her one more piece of advice, her tone serious. "In the next few days, I need you to bring Olivia in for a blood test. It's just precautionary, but we have to rule out any infections, especially rabies. I just want to be sure." Grace did as Eleanor instructed, taking Olivia to the lab for the tests. She dropped the results off at Eleanor's office a few days later when Eleanor wasn't home. But when Eleanor called Grace that same afternoon, the unease that had been hovering in the back of her mind suddenly spiked. "Elena, what's wrong?" Grace asked, her voice shaky. "Is it the tests? Is Olivia sick?" "No, Grace, Olivia isn't sick," Elena reassured her, though there was an unsettling note in her voice. "But there's something in the results I need to talk to you about. In person." The urgency in Elena's voice made Grace's heart pound. Without wasting another second, she grabbed Olivia and headed straight to Elena's office. While Olivia distracted herself in the waiting room, Elena led Grace into a small, private space. "Please, Elena," Grace said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What's going on? You're scaring me." Elena looked her friend straight in the eye, her face grave. "The blood tests didn't show any infections, but there's something off. One of the results came back abnormal, which is why I ran additional tests." Grace felt the air leave the room, her pulse quickening. She leaned forward, her voice barely holding steady. "What do you mean, abnormal? What does that even mean?" Before Elena could answer, Grace's mind was already racing, every worst-case scenario flashing before her eyes. Later that day, Grace replayed everything as they sat in the back of the taxi. Olivia, quiet and withdrawn, sat with her head resting against the window, lost in her own world. Charlie had leaned over and kissed Olivia gently on the forehead, wrapping her in a tender hug, before they left the clinic. "You'll be okay, Olivia," she whispered. "Please, be strong." That small moment between the girls had brought Grace a tiny sliver of peace, something to cling to in the midst of the chaos. The bond between Olivia and Charlie was the only thing that felt real, steady, as everything else unraveled. As the taxi moved through the still, quiet streets, Grace's thoughts spiraled again. She didn't want this to turn into something everyone would talk about. She didn't want the world to know Olivia's pain. A sudden impulse struck her. "Sir," she said, leaning forward, her voice urgent, "please, change direction. We're not going to the hospital. Take us to Dr. Elena's practice instead." Grace trusted Elena. She knew that whatever was happening, Elena would help her navigate it without Olivia becoming a spectacle. When they arrived, Grace could barely stand. She knocked hurriedly, her hand shaking, and Eleanor appeared at the door, surprised but calm. "What's going on, Grace?" Eleanor asked, instantly noticing the exhaustion and fear etched into her friend's face. "It's Olivia," Grace choked out, the words sticking in her throat. "Something horrible has happened." She broke down completely, unable to keep up the facade of strength any longer. Without hesitation, Eleanor led them inside. The weight of knowing what her daughter had gone through was unbearable, yet all Grace could focus on now was shielding Olivia from any more pain. "What are we going to do, Eleanor? I can't let anyone find out about this," she murmured, her voice cracking under the strain. Elena's eyes softened, but her tone remained steady. "We'll take it one step at a time, Grace. But first, we need to make sure Olivia is all right." That night, in the small confines of Elena's office, Grace couldn't hold back her tears. The fear and helplessness overwhelmed her as she desperately sought guidance from her friend. Eleanor, remaining calm, did her best to provide reassurance. "Grace, I need you to breathe. This could have been an accident. There's no reason to make this public unless we have to," she said gently as she tended to Olivia's wounds. Grace nodded weakly, but the knot of worry in her chest refused to loosen. As they were about to leave, Eleanor offered a crucial piece of advice. "Grace, in the next few days, take Olivia for a blood test. We need to rule out any possible infections, especially rabies, just to be safe." Several days later, Grace followed through, taking Olivia to the lab. The wait was agonizing, but she finally dropped off the results at Elena's office while her friend was out. That same afternoon, Grace's phone rang, and a sense of unease swept over her as she saw Elena's name on the screen. "Elena, is everything all right? Did the test show anything? Is Olivia sick?" Grace's voice trembled, barely keeping her fear in check. "No, Grace," Elena replied, but there was a hint of something in her voice that made Grace's stomach tighten. "Olivia isn't sick, but I need you to come back. There's something I need to explain in person." Grace's heart raced as she hurried to Elena's office later that evening, Olivia in tow. While Olivia distracted herself in the waiting room, Grace followed Elena into a small, private office, her anxiety mounting with every step. "Please, Elena, tell me what's going on. What did you find?" Grace's voice wavered, her nerves on edge. Elena's expression was grave as she finally spoke. "The blood tests didn't show any infections, but one result stood out. I ordered an additional test to be sure." Grace sat back, her hands trembling in her lap. "Olivia has only been around me, Charlie, and sometimes Charlie's mother, but only under my supervision. She's homeschooled. There's no man in her life. There's been no opportunity for something like this to happen." Her words hung heavy in the room, thick with confusion and denial. Elena listened, her brows furrowed in thought, processing everything. Both women were battling to push away the most disturbing possibility, but there was no ignoring the one event that loomed over everything: the incident with Bear, their family dog. "Grace, that's simply not possible," Eleanor said, her tone firm. "Even though some species can interbreed, it's biologically impossible for humans and dogs. There's no way Bear could have caused this." Grace nodded, but the seed of doubt that had taken root refused to go away. With every logical explanation ruled out, what remained made no sense. She swallowed hard before asking, her voice heavy with exhaustion, "What do we do now?" Eleanor, looking both concerned and determined, replied, "I'll dig deeper into this. I'll talk to some colleagues, make sure we're not overlooking anything. But don't worry, Grace, you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." That night, Grace returned home with Olivia, the weight of uncertainty pressing down harder than ever. As they approached the front door, Olivia glanced up at her mother, her innocent face etched with worry. "Mum, are you okay? You seem so sad," she asked, her voice soft, full of concern that a girl her age shouldn't have to feel. Grace forced a smile, brushing her hand through Olivia's hair. "I'm just tired, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine," she said, though the words felt hollow in her throat, weighed down by the storm of emotions she was hiding. Olivia, sensing her mother's unease but not pressing further, nodded and walked quietly inside. Grace stood there for a moment longer, the chill of the evening air mixing with the dread that clung to her skin. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sleep evaded her that night, her mind spinning in a million directions, desperately searching for answers that still seemed out of reach. No matter how hard she tried, peace felt like an impossible dream. The unknown haunted her every thought, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. Days passed, and slowly Olivia seemed to return to her usual self. She spent time outside again, laughing with Charlie in the backyard like the carefree girl she used to be. But Grace couldn't let go of what had happened. Every time Olivia smiled, Grace felt the weight of her secret pressing harder, pulling her deeper into her own quiet panic. Bear remained tied up in the yard, his once trusted presence now a reminder of the fear Grace couldn't escape. She couldn't bear to take any more risks, couldn't let anything else happen. "Mum, please, let him go. He's not going to hurt me. I miss him," Olivia pleaded every day, her voice cracking, eyes welling up with tears. Each time she begged, Grace's resolve wavered, but she kept her tone firm. "No, Olivia, I can't. It's for your own good," she said, though it broke her heart a little more each time. What Olivia didn't know was that Grace had already made an even harder decision. She was planning to take Bear to the animal shelter to be euthanized. The thought of keeping him around after what had happened was unbearable. But, despite her resolve, Grace couldn't bring herself to follow through. A part of her couldn't stand the thought of Bear being gone, and Olivia's constant pleas made it all the harder. From her bedroom window, Olivia would sit and watch Bear, tied up and alone in the yard, his once proud figure now forlorn. She would cry softly, pleading with her mother every day to let him go. But Grace, torn between guilt and fear, could only look away. Meanwhile, Elena had taken it upon herself to dig deeper into the mystery. Without revealing the entire story, she consulted with various specialists, geneticists, biologists, and veterinarians, hoping for some clarity. After many conversations, the experts all came to the same conclusion. In nature, certain species could indeed crossbreed if they were closely related, like mules, born from a horse and a donkey, or ligers, the offspring of a lion and a tiger. But when it came to humans and dogs, the answer was clear. It was impossible. "There's no scientific precedent, Grace," Eleanor explained after her findings. "Myths and urban legends exist, but there's absolutely no evidence to back them up." Grace's stomach twisted as she listened. "Then, what's happening to Olivia?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Eleanor met her gaze, her own uncertainty mirrored in Grace's eyes. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "We'll have to wait and see what develops." As the weeks crawled by, Grace's anxiety only grew worse. By the 6th week, Elena decided it was time to perform an ultrasound. As the screen flickered to life, Grace's worst fears were realized. There, on the monitor, was a developing fetus. Grace's heart sank. Eleanor, her face tense with worry, studied the image before speaking. "I can't say for certain if what we're looking at is fully human," she admitted, her voice tight with unease. "We'll need to wait until the baby is more developed before we know anything for sure." The air felt heavy around Grace, suffocating. Doubt, fear, and a growing sense of dread churned in her chest. What exactly was growing inside her daughter? Despite the unsettling suspicion about Bear, both Eleanor and Grace knew they couldn't rule out the possibility of a man being involved. The thought seemed absurd at first, but Eleanor had to consider every possibility. Grace's mind raced as she tried to piece together what could have happened. Had Olivia ever been alone with a man? No matter how hard she tried to recall, she couldn't think of any time that would have allowed for something like this to occur. But still, doubt lingered. With a gentle but firm tone, Grace approached Olivia one evening, sitting beside her daughter on the bed. "Olivia, honey, have you ever been alone with any man?" she asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the tension in her voice. Olivia's brow furrowed in confusion. "No, Mom, never," she replied softly, clearly puzzled by the question. Still not entirely convinced, Grace decided to ask Charlie, Olivia's closest friend. If anyone knew Olivia's secrets, it would be her. The next day, Grace invited Charlie over, her voice kind but laced with concern. She asked Charlie the same question. Charlie shook her head, looking just as confused. "No, Mrs. Grace, Olivia never mentioned anything about a guy. She was always with Bear. That is, until all this happened." Charlie's words sent another wave of doubt through Grace. How could there be no explanation, no suspect, besides the impossible? Every lead seemed to hit a dead end. Yet Olivia's growing belly told a different story. And by the time 3.5 months had passed, her pregnancy was undeniable. Grace became consumed by fear that someone would notice. She couldn't risk it. If the neighbors found out, the whispers would begin, and soon the whole town would know. Olivia's life, already in turmoil, would be shattered by the weight of the scandal. In an attempt to protect her, Grace decided that Charlie could no longer come over. Olivia's secret had to be kept safe at all costs. "Mum, please, let me see Bear," Olivia begged through sobs one night. But Grace's response was resolute, though it tore her apart to see her daughter so heartbroken. "I can't, Olivia," she said softly but firmly. As the weeks passed, Olivia's body changed in ways she couldn't ignore. Her stomach swelled in strange, unnatural ways, and soon she started asking questions that Grace wasn't ready to answer. The nausea, the cravings, the vomiting. It was all too much to hide. Grace dodged Olivia's questions as best she could, but deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth could no longer be buried. Olivia, filled with both curiosity and fear, began scouring the internet, binge-watching shows, and slowly piecing together the fragments of what her body was telling her. It didn't take long for the anxiety to overwhelm her, and one afternoon she finally broke down. In a voice trembling with desperation, she asked her mother directly, "Am I pregnant, Mom?" Her eyes were wide, searching for a truth she already dreaded. Grace, unable to hold back the truth any longer, pulled Olivia into her arms. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over as she whispered, "Yes, honey, you are." The words felt like a final blow, confirming what they both had feared. As the weight of it all came crashing down, mother and daughter held each other tight, tears mixing with their shared sorrow. Grace promised, through quiet sobs, that no matter what, she wouldn't leave Olivia's side, that they'd face this together. But despite Grace's words, Olivia seemed to slip further into her despair. Days blurred into weeks, and by the time her pregnancy reached its 4th month, Olivia had sunk deep into depression. Her appetite disappeared, her energy faded, and the things that once made her laugh, TV, painting, even playing outside, became meaningless. Grace watched helplessly as her once vibrant daughter became a shell of the girl she used to know. Each day, Grace's anxiety grew stronger. She couldn't stand watching Olivia waste away. "I have to do something," she thought, her heart racing with the need to fix things. Maybe seeing Charlie, Olivia's best friend, would help. Grace wondered if Charlie's presence could somehow lift her daughter's spirits. And maybe, just maybe, if she asked Charlie to keep the pregnancy a secret, she could bring her over without too much worry. Holding on to that slim hope, Grace approached Olivia about it. "Sweetheart, what do you think about seeing Charlie? Would you like that?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light, hoping to see even the smallest flicker of excitement in her daughter's eyes. But to Grace's surprise, Olivia shook her head, her voice unexpectedly firm. "I don't want to see Charlie." There was a pause, then Olivia added, quieter this time, "I want to see Bear." Grace froze. Something about the way Olivia said it sent a chill down her spine. It didn't make sense. Why would she want to see the dog? Grace thought, her heart racing with unease. Worried and unsure of what to do next, she called Dr. Elena. "Eleanor," Grace said, her voice tight with concern, "Olivia only asks for the dog now. She doesn't want to see anyone else, not even Charlie." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Eleanor spoke. "Grace, this is becoming a psychological issue. Whatever attachment Olivia has to Bear right now, it's not healthy. You need to keep them apart." Despite the warning, Grace felt trapped. She didn't know what else to do. So, gathering her courage, she decided to visit Charlie's house. Her heart was heavy as she made her way across the street, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights and constant tears. When Charlie's mother opened the door, Grace could barely hold herself together. Through her sobs, Grace finally confessed. "Olivia's pregnant," she blurted out, her voice cracking. "That's why she's been shut away in the house, why she won't see anyone." Charlie and her mother stood frozen, stunned by the revelation. After what felt like an eternity, Charlie's mother finally spoke, her voice laced with disbelief. "Who's the father?" she asked, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. Grace's heart sank deeper. "We don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sensing Grace's distress, Charlie's mother immediately reassured her, "Don't worry, Grace. We won't tell a soul. We're here for you." The kindness brought a small flicker of hope to Grace's chest. Maybe this could help. Charlie even offered to come by and visit Olivia. And, despite her nerves, Grace agreed, holding on to the hope that her daughter might be lifted, even if just a little. That afternoon, Grace knocked softly on Olivia's door. "Sweetheart, "I've got a surprise for you. Someone's here to see you," she said, her voice gentle. Olivia stirred from her bed, her eyes lighting up for a moment. "Bear?" she asked, her voice filled with a fleeting excitement as she opened the door, only to retreat back into her bed. "I don't want to see anyone else," Olivia said, her voice sharp. "Just Bear." Grace's heart broke all over again. She turned back to Charlie, forcing a strained smile as she explained, "I'm so sorry, Charlie. She's just not herself." Charlie nodded with understanding. "It's okay, Mrs. Grace. I know she's going through something really tough right now." As Charlie walked home, Grace watched through the window. Bear, chained in the backyard, erupted into furious barking the moment he spotted Charlie. The growls were relentless, and Grace saw Charlie freeze in her tracks, eyes locked on the dog. After a moment, she turned and ran the rest of the way home, clearly shaken. Seeing it all unfold, Grace's emotions flared. She stormed out into the yard, her anger boiling over as she approached Bear. "Shut up! This is all your fault!" she yelled, her voice shaking with rage. Bear only quieted when Charlie disappeared from sight, leaving Grace standing there, trembling, overwhelmed with helplessness. The weeks passed slowly, the weight of everything dragging Grace down. It was finally time for Olivia's next ultrasound. As they sat in Dr. Elena's office, Grace's heart pounded in her chest. The ultrasound revealed that the baby was developing normally, but Elena's caution lingered. "Everything looks good, Grace," Elena said, her voice calm but serious. "But there are still some things we can't detect just yet. We'll need more tests. The DNA test will give us the final answer." For a fleeting moment, Grace felt a glimmer of relief. If the baby was human, who could possibly be the father? The question gnawed at her, persistent and relentless, giving her no peace. As they drove home in silence, both Grace and Olivia were consumed by their own thoughts. Grace's mind couldn't stop racing, circling around the results. Would the test confirm her deepest fears or dismiss them entirely? Olivia, on the other hand, was slipping further into herself, retreating to a place where Grace couldn't reach her. The light in her eyes seemed to grow dimmer with each passing day, swallowed by the weight of whatever she was hiding. When they finally pulled into the driveway and stepped inside the house, the air felt thick, heavy, with unspoken words. Grace, still with eyes swollen from crying, approached her daughter, desperate for some truth. She knelt down in front of Olivia, her voice shaking. "Please, Olivia, you have to tell me what's going on. If it wasn't Bear, then who? Who could have done this?" The tremor in her voice betrayed the calm she was trying to hold on to. Olivia remained silent for a long moment, staring at the floor, her face unreadable. Grace felt her heart tighten, fearing that her daughter might never speak. But then Olivia looked up. The pain in her mother's eyes seemed to finally break something inside her. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice fragile but sincere, "I need time. I promise I'll tell you the truth, but not yet." It wasn't everything Grace had hoped for, but it was something, a promise. And in that moment, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, like a weight had been lifted off her chest, if only slightly. Tears welled up again, but this time they weren't born of fear or frustration. Grace pulled Olivia into a tight embrace, her lips pressing gentle kisses on her daughter's hair. "No matter what it is, no matter what you tell me, I'm here. I'll always be here for you," she whispered, her voice filled with love and quiet determination. Later that afternoon, as the house settled into an uneasy calm, Grace couldn't keep her thoughts at bay. The mystery that had haunted her day and night, gnawing at her from the inside, was finally on the brink of being revealed. There would be an answer. Soon. She needed to tell Elena. Grabbing her phone, Grace quickly dialed her number, her fingers shaking slightly. "Elena," Grace breathed, barely able to keep the emotion from her voice. "Olivia promised me she's going to tell the truth. We're finally going to know." "That's amazing, Grace," Elena responded, her voice steady but full of hope. "I'm so glad. Let's wait for her to open up when she's ready, and then we'll get to the bottom of this together." Grace hung up, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a spark of hope in the midst of all the darkness. She walked next door to her neighbor's house, where Charlie and her mother were sitting on the couch watching TV. Grace joined them, the tension in her shoulders easing a little as she sank into the cushions. "Olivia promised to tell me everything," Grace said softly, a small smile creeping onto her face. "We're going to figure this out." Charlie and her mother nodded, relief crossing their faces. But as Charlie glanced over at Grace, something flickered in her expression. Something Grace couldn't quite place. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, and Grace pushed the thought aside. She couldn't afford to overthink everything right now. Later that night, the sky unleashed a storm, rain lashing against the windows, the wind howling through the trees like it had something to say. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning cracked across the sky in bright, jagged streaks. Grace tucked Olivia into bed, pressing a kiss to her forehead, lingering just a moment longer. "I love you, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay," she whispered, her words more a prayer than a promise. She flicked off the light and closed the door quietly behind her, hoping Olivia could find some kind of peace, even in the middle of the storm. Grace, exhausted herself, decided to run a hot bath to unwind. She sank into the warm water, closing her eyes, hoping the heat would melt away the tension that had coiled tight in her muscles. But before she could even relax, the sharp, jarring sound of barking pierced through her fragile calm. Bear. Again. "Not now," Grace muttered under her breath, irritated. She threw on her robe and stormed outside, her bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. Bear was at it again, barking wildly, pulling at his chain like something had possessed him. His agitation had grown worse in recent days, and Grace's patience had run out. "Shut up already!" she shouted, frustration flaring in her voice. "I'm so sick of this!" Without thinking, she grabbed her car keys and unhooked Bear from his chain, shoving him into the back seat. She drove to the animal shelter, her mind made up. When she arrived, her voice was cold, clipped as she spoke to the attendant. "Put him down," she said, showing no hesitation. Bear was led to a small kennel, his fate sealed. Back home, Grace slipped into the bath once again, eager to drown out her thoughts in the quiet. At the shelter, Bear lay motionless in his cage, staring into the distance. The attendant, syringe in hand, slowly approached. For a brief moment he hesitated, noticing Bear's eerie stillness, wondering if the dog had already given up. But just as the cage door creaked open, Bear sprang to life, bolting out in a flash, leaving nothing but the echoes of the storm behind him. He had only pretended to lie still. In a flash, Bear sprang up, bolting through the heavy downpour, his paws slipping on the slick pavement. But he didn't stop. For a moment he looked lost, dazed in the rain. But then something clicked. He knew the way home. With renewed focus, he sped up, driven by a single, fierce purpose. Meanwhile, Grace, completely drained from the emotional storm of the day, had fallen asleep in the bathtub. About half an hour later, she jolted awake, startled by a scream piercing the quiet of the house. Her heart raced as she grabbed her robe, rushing out of the bathroom. Where was that sound coming from? "Olivia!" she called, panic tightening her throat when she heard Olivia's desperate cries coming from upstairs. She bolted up the staircase, her thoughts a frantic whirl of fear. When she reached Olivia's bedroom door, it was locked. Inside, she could hear her daughter's terrified screams mixed with something far worse, Bear's frantic barks. "This can't be happening," Grace gasped, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I got rid of that dog. How could he be here?" Fueled by both terror and fury, Grace threw herself against the door with all the strength she could muster. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, giving her a power she didn't know she had. With one last forceful shove, the door splintered open. The room was shrouded in shadows, dimly lit by a small nightlight that flickered eerily. Thunder boomed through the house, and flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the space in bursts of ghostly light. What she saw made Grace freeze in place. Olivia was on her bed, screaming in terror, while Bear darted around the room like a mad creature, barking wildly. But what stopped Grace cold was Charlie, soaking wet, locked in a desperate struggle with the dog as lightning flickered, casting haunting shapes across the walls. "Help me!" Charlie cried, grappling with Bear. "I heard him barking from my house and came to save Olivia. I climbed up the vines to her window. Now he's trying to bite me." Grace, shocked by Charlie's sudden presence, how had she even gotten into the house unnoticed, had no time to question it. Her daughter and Charlie were in danger. She had to act. With a wave of fear and rage crashing over her, Grace lunged at Bear. "I'll kill you!" she shouted, her hands finding the dog's neck as she grabbed him, her fingers digging into his fur. Bear growled and fought, but Grace's rage fueled her. The flickering light from the lamp painted dark, erratic shadows on the walls as she wrestled with the dog. Through the chaos, Olivia's voice broke through. "Mum, stop. Don't hurt Bear. It's not his fault. I'll tell you everything." Her daughter's desperate plea hit Grace like a hammer. For a moment she faltered, confused, trying to make sense of what Olivia was saying. But the terror of the dog attacking again overpowered her hesitation. After several more agonizing seconds, Bear went limp in Grace's grip, collapsing to the floor, unconscious. Grace, shaking and breathless, believed the worst was over. But before she could catch her breath, a sharp blow landed on the back of her head. Pain shot through her skull, and she crumpled to the ground, half conscious. Though her body refused to move, her mind remained alert, her eyes only half open. And through that hazy vision, Grace's heart dropped when she heard Olivia scream, "Charlie, don't hurt my mum. Please, leave us alone." Charlie's response was cold, chilling. "I told you, Olivia. If you told your mum the truth, I'd kill both of you." Grace lay there, helpless, a wave of dread and grief crushing her. She wanted to get up, to shield her daughter from what was coming, but her body was unresponsive, locked in pain. Olivia's voice broke through the room again, desperate and pleading. "Charlie, please, don't hurt her. I won't tell anyone, I swear." Olivia sobbed. Charlie's fury erupted. "It's too late," she screamed, her voice thick with rage. She lunged at Olivia, grabbing a pillow and pressing it down on her face, pinning her down. Olivia thrashed beneath her, fighting for breath as lightning bathed the room in an eerie glow. Grace, still paralyzed from the blow, watched the horrifying scene unfold, powerless to stop it. Every time she tried to move, sharp pain surged through her, rendering her motionless. She was trapped in her own body, unable to protect her daughter. But then, through her blurred vision, Grace noticed something. Bear, the dog she thought was unconscious, began to stir. Slowly, Painfully, the pit bull pushed himself up from the floor, his body shaking with the effort. Gathering the last of his strength, Bear charged at Charlie with a fierce growl. "No! Get off me, you stupid dog!" Charlie screamed, struggling against Bear's sudden attack. "I'll kill you too!" The fight between them was violent, chaotic. Charlie wrestled to push Bear away, but the dog wouldn't let go, driven by an instinct to protect Olivia. The room crackled with tension, the storm raging outside, as the struggle between girl and dog raged on. In a desperate attempt to flee, Charlie wrenched herself free and darted toward the window, hoping to make a quick escape. But the heavy downpour outside had turned the windowsill slick, and in her frantic haste, her foot slipped. Grace heard the sickening thud as Charlie's body hit the ground below. For a split second, everything fell silent. Charlie had fallen hard, her body crumpled unnaturally on the rain-soaked lawn. Grace, still sprawled on the floor, weak and aching, knew immediately what had happened. Her heart clenched as she heard the impact, and a moment later the storm roared back with a vengeance, lashing the house once more. Inside, all was quiet. Olivia rushed to her mother, helping her sit up with trembling hands. They clung to each other, shaking, unable to comprehend the horror of what had just transpired. Bear, bruised but faithful, limped over to them, licking their hands softly, sensing the turmoil in the air. The three of them huddled together, finding a brief, fleeting sense of comfort amidst the chaos that had shattered their night. Grace, her head pounding with pain, shakily reached for her phone. Her fingers fumbled, but she managed to dial 911. Within minutes, the flashing lights of police cruisers lit up the street, casting eerie reflections through the rain-soaked windows. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Charlie's mother, who, upon seeing her daughter lying motionless on the ground, ran toward her with a cry that pierced the night. Her face contorted in anguish as she cradled Charlie's still form in her arms, tears mixing with the rain as she sobbed for her child. The police arrived quickly, assessing the scene. Grace, her voice still shaky and raw, recounted the terrifying events to the officers. They listened intently, jotting down notes as she spoke, while Olivia stood by her side, silent but clearly overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had unfolded. Grace's heart raced as she turned to her daughter, sensing there was more to the story than what had been said so far. "Sweetheart," Grace's voice wavered, heavy with concern. "I need you to tell me everything now, the whole truth." Olivia's lips trembled and her eyes welled up with tears. Her voice was barely audible as she began, "Mom, Charlie's not like other girls. One day when we were in the shower together, I saw she had a boy's body part." Grace's heart stopped, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Charlie was a boy, Mum. She told me her name was Noel, and she begged me not to tell anyone. She said it was a secret." Olivia's voice cracked with emotion. "Over time, he started asking me to do things with him, to experiment. I didn't want to, but that night, Noel forced me." Olivia's body shook as sobs overtook her. Bear was under the bed. He started barking to protect me. Grace's entire world collapsed as she listened to her daughter. The room seemed to spin, her mind racing to piece together the horror of what Olivia had endured. When Noel saw the blood and heard Bear, he panicked. "He threatened me, Mum. Said if I ever told you, he'd kill us both." Olivia's tears flowed freely now, her body trembling with every word. "That's why I didn't say anything. I was so scared." Grace pulled Olivia into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her own face. Her heart broke for her daughter, for everything Olivia had been through, and the immense fear she had carried alone. It all made sense now why Noel had tried to pin the blame on Bear. He had been desperate, trying to cover his tracks before the truth came out. The following day, the investigation continued. When Charlie, now revealed as Noel, regained consciousness, the police questioned him. But the most shocking revelation came from his own mother. In tears, she confessed that Noel had struggled with his identity for years, wanting to live as a girl in public while privately battling his own urges. Noel had seen Olivia as an easy target, and when he realized she might reveal the truth, he knew he had to take drastic action. That stormy night, he had sneaked into Olivia's room with the intent of silencing her for good. But Bear's relentless barking had driven him away. When Noel found out Bear had been removed from the house, he seized the opportunity, sneaking back in with every intention of finishing what he had started. He hadn't anticipated Bear returning to save Olivia once again. Noel was sent to a rehabilitation center for troubled teens, where he would also receive psychiatric care. The revelation rocked the neighborhood, but for Grace and Olivia, it was a small relief that the truth had finally surfaced. Dr. Eleanor, who had been aware of the situation, began visiting regularly to ensure Grace and Olivia were recovering. For a brief time, peace returned to their home. Bear, once suspected, was now celebrated as a hero. Olivia adored him more than ever, and Grace, despite everything, felt a deep gratitude toward the dog that had protected her daughter. But peace didn't last long. One night, Olivia woke up in a panic, clutching her abdomen in pain. She looked down to see a red stain spreading across her sheets, and terror gripped her. "Mom! Mom!" she screamed, her voice thick with fear. Grace rushed into the room, her heart in her throat as she saw the blood. Without hesitation, she gathered Olivia into her arms and sped to Dr. Eleanor's office. Eleanor worked quickly, stabilizing Olivia, but when she emerged from the exam room, her face was grim. "Grace," she said softly, her eyes filled with worry. "We need to talk." "Grace, I'm so sorry. Olivia's body just couldn't sustain the pregnancy any longer. She's lost the baby," Eleanor spoke softly, though the gravity of her words was unmistakable. A heavy knot formed in Grace's throat, her heart sinking with the weight of the news. Even through the grief, a quiet voice in her mind whispered that maybe, under these circumstances, this was the kindest outcome. She walked over to Olivia, her heart aching with every step. Her daughter's tear-filled eyes met hers, silently pleading for an explanation, something to make sense of the pain. Grace knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around Olivia's trembling body. "Sweetheart, the baby. It's gone," she whispered, holding her close, feeling her daughter's sorrow pour out as they clung to each other. Together, they wept, their tears mingling with shared heartbreak. For Olivia, the devastation ran deep, but as the days passed, there was a fragile sense of relief. It wasn't that the pain vanished, but knowing her mother was beside her, offering unwavering support through every agonizing moment, brought a strange kind of comfort. In the weeks that followed, the world slowly righted itself, piece by piece. The dark cloud that had loomed so heavily began to lift, and life, tentatively but surely, began to return to something resembling normal. Olivia, after enduring so much, began to heal, both inside and out. Little by little, the light in her eyes returned, and she found her way back to happiness. With Grace's constant love and the fierce protective presence of Bear, Olivia felt a sense of security she hadn't known in what felt like forever. Gradually, she started reconnecting with life. New friendships formed, and she even began her studies again, venturing out beyond the walls of home. Every day, without fail, Bear would be there waiting by the door, tail wagging eagerly as Olivia returned. She adored him, her guardian, her loyal companion, and with each passing day, joy and peace seeped back into their lives. At last, the shadows of the past faded, leaving behind the warmth of love and the hope of better days ahead. Hey everyone! Before we wrap up this intense story, I just want to take a moment to reflect on what we've shared. First off, this story is entirely fictional. It's a creative work meant to engage our emotions and keep us on the edge of our seats. But while the story of Grace and Olivia may not be real, it brings to light some very real and heartbreaking issues. Olivia, in the end, was lucky. She had the unwavering support of her mother, Grace, and the fierce loyalty of Bear by her side. But sadly, many children in our world don't have that same support. There are countless children who face trauma, abuse, and neglect, and they're not as fortunate to have someone like Grace who fights to protect them at every turn. The outcome for those children can be far worse, and the scars much deeper. As parents, guardians, and members of a community, it's our job to be vigilant. We need to protect our kids, to listen to them, and create safe spaces where they can express their feelings without fear. This story, although fiction, reminds us how fragile children are and how important it is to notice when something's wrong before it's too late. Let's take this as a reminder to always be aware of the signs of abuse, to advocate for our children's well-being, and to never overlook the power of being there for them. If this story resonated with you or brought up any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Drop a comment below. Let's chat about what you took away from Olivia's journey and how we, as a society, can do better to protect those who need us most. Thanks for watching, and stay safe, everyone. You're never alone.